Today we're looking at an example FRQ that includes a T account. Now you can see from the example we did in class that this is a much more simplified version of a T account. But again, you have a couple of key components that you're going to see consistently. You're going to see the demand deposits, and from that they can then work in the fractional reserve banking system, looking at whether or not how much has to be required reserves, any excess reserves, what banks could loan out, things of that nature. Now this is just a commercial bank portion of a T account. So you're not going to see buying and selling of bonds in this example, but you're going to see a lot of the same similarities of the commercial bank line from the example we did in class. And so in this FRQ, just to kind of go over the question, to point out some things to look for before we start discussing what the actual answer would be. For part A, what is the reserve requirement? So you're looking at what banks are required by law to hold on to. B, assume that Luis withdraws $5,000 in cash from his checking account. And so that's going to set up the three parts for B. Part 1, by how much will the bank's reserves change? 2, what is the initial effect of the withdrawal on the M1 measure of the money supply? And for the third part, as a result of the withdrawal, what is the new value of excess reserves on the balance sheet of the bank? And then for part C, it's simply asking if somebody else were to come in and withdraw an amount that exceeds the bank's excess reserves, what would they have to do to cover its required reserves? So let's start to look at how we would actually go about answering this question. So for part A, we're looking at what is the reserve requirement. So what are banks required to hold on to? Now we can see that the reserve or required reserves are $10,000. Now one kind of tip for you as you're answering this question: required reserves and reserve requirement essentially get at the same thing, except there's one kind of key difference. When we talk about required reserves, we're typically talking about a dollar amount, the actual money that the bank has to hold on to. Whereas when we're talking about the reserve requirement, it's always going to be in the form of a percentage. So for A, your answer is going to be in the form of a percent. So we know that the required reserves is $10,000, and then we can see we got our required reserves here. We can see over here our demand deposit of $100,000. And so all you're going to do is, what percent is 10,000 of 100,000? And so that would give us, for part A, an answer of 10%. So the reserve requirement is 10%. Now one thing you have to look for, some people have the tendency to add 10,000 and 5,000 together, and so they would get the answer of 15%. Banks only have to legally hold on to the required reserves. In this particular example, they've loaned out 85,000 and have chosen voluntarily to hold on to an extra 5,000. That's what the excess reserves are. So we're only, for the reserve requirement, interested in what the required reserves would be. So moving on to part B, assume that Luis withdraws $5,000 in cash from his checking account. So for part 1, if Luis withdraws $5,000, by how much will the bank's reserve change based on Luis' withdrawal? So if Luis is withdrawing the $5,000, that $5,000 is going to come from our demand deposits, right? And so if Luis withdraws $5,000, for part 1, the bank's reserves will change by $5,000. Nothing tricky here, just a straightforward $5,000 are being deducted, so the amount that banks are liable for has decreased by $5,000. The trickiest part of this question actually comes in part 2. What's the initial effect of the withdrawal on the M1 measure of money supply? So again, it's asking what the impact is on the most highly liquid types of money. So kind of go through your head what is in the M1 category and what is in the M2 category. Look back at the scenario. He withdraws $5,000 in cash. So cash is an example of M1 from his checking account. Now, checking account or checkable deposits also are in M1. So therefore, there would be no effect on the M1 measure of money supply. He's taking $5,000 from a checking account, which is in M1, and moving it into cash, which is also M1. If they would have said savings account, he withdraws $5,000 in cash from his savings account, then it would have increased by $5,000. But because it's from his checking account, there's simply no effect. Now, part 3 of B is probably the most difficult point to get on this 5-point FRQ. So as a result of the withdrawal, what is the new value of excess reserves? Okay, so let's walk through this. We said Luis withdrew $5,000. Well, that $5,000 came from the demand deposits. So the demand deposits decreased by $5,000. Now, over here, to balance it out, the bank can simply use their $5,000 in excess reserves, right? Okay, back to what we were looking at. Now, like I said, the $5,000 is going to come from our demand deposits. To balance it out, it's going to come over on the asset side from the excess reserves. Now, the part that people will forget about, though, is if our demand deposit drops, then the amount that is required to hold on to would drop. So they would no longer, if we lose $5,000 from our demand deposits, take 10% of that, and that would be what the bank would no longer have to hold on to. So even though the excess reserves were wiped out by Luis's withdrawal, because on the liability side it's now down to $95,000, that means they can pull $500 from the required reserves down into excess reserves. So part 3, the answer would be $500. Now for part C, is just assume that something happens where they have to dip into their required reserves. That's essentially what the FRQ is looking for. No math involved for part C. This simply recalls, do you understand how banks operate and how banks can meet their reserve? For the Mitera Bank, all they would have to do is simply borrow from another commercial bank or use the discount window and borrow from the Federal Reserve. Either of those answers would be acceptable, and that would be the last point on this FRQ. So this FRQ is 5 points total. We've kind of walked you through the answer. Let me put the official rubric back up on the screen, so if you need to look at that, you've got kind of the official answers here. It's 1 point for part A, 3 points for part B, and 1 point for part C. And that would be just one example of a T account FRQ. So hopefully that kind of clears up a little bit of any possible confusion you may have had as you work through it in class.